In 1968, a 23-vehicle convoy vanished in the Vietnamese jungle. 56 years later, satellite technology found them. But the real question is, why were they never searched for? Don't forget to subscribe so more people can hear these buried stories. March 2024. National Geographic documentary filmmaker Lisa Park had been staring at her computer screen for 14 straight hours. Her eyes burned from analyzing cutting-edge satellite imagery, but she couldn't stop. This wasn't just another mapping project. This was personal. Her grandfather had fought in Vietnam. Staff Sergeant Robert Park, 1st Infantry Division, KIA March 1968. Body never recovered. For 30 years, Lisa had wondered what really happened to him in those jungle depths. The satellite data was part of a new environmental survey funded by the Vietnamese government to document deforestation patterns. Lisa volunteered for the project, hoping she might find some trace of her grandfather's final battle. Among the flowing green pixels on her screen, something caught her attention. Geometric shapes. Nature doesn't create such perfect lines. What is this? She murmured, zooming in on the image. Metal, rusted but still recognizably metal. Vehicles, many vehicles, at least 20, maybe more. They formed a rough convoy formation, as if they'd been traveling together when they stopped. Lisa's coffee grew cold as she cross-referenced the coordinates. This location was nowhere near any recorded battle sites. No roads, no villages. Just dense jungle that hadn't been disturbed by human activity since the war. Lisa's heart raced. Her first thought was simple. Traffic accident. But these vehicles were at least 40 to 50 years old. Moreover, this was deep in the forest where no roads existed. But what she discovered next would shatter everything she thought she knew about the Vietnam War. The next day she applied to the US Embassy in Hanoi. Getting an appointment wasn't easy. She had to name-drop her National Geographic credentials and mention her grandfather's service record. Finally, they connected her with military archives specialist Colonel James Wilson. Wilson was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades keeping other people's secrets. His office walls were covered with commendations, unit photos, and maps of Southeast Asia marked with red pins. When Lisa showed him the satellite photos, Wilson's reaction wasn't what she expected. He didn't lean in with curiosity. Instead, he pushed back in his chair like the images had physically struck him. "Dear God," he said quietly, removing his reading glasses. "Those are our vehicles." Wilson walked to a locked filing cabinet, produced a key from his pocket, and retrieved a thick manila folder. The label read Classified, Eyes Only, Charlie Company, Maya Files. But as the file expanded, they realized the records had been deliberately thinned. Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 23 vehicles, 89 soldiers. Left Quang Tri Province on April 15, 1968. Never seen again. Lisa's hands trembled as she looked at the personnel roster. Name after name of young men, most barely out of their teens. Martinez, David A. Rodriguez, James P. Thompson, William K. "My grandfather was 1st Infantry," Lisa said. "Different unit, but he went missing around the same time." Wilson's expression darkened. "March 15th, Bravo Company?" "Yes. How did you?" "Because Bravo Company was supposed to rendezvous with Charlie Company on April 20th. Neither unit ever made it to the meeting point." Lisa felt the room spinning. Her grandfather hadn't just died in Vietnam. He'd died walking into the same trap that claimed Charlie Company. If two units never reached the same point, the same hand had directed them both. As Wilson kept reading, one line froze the room. Lisa was speechless. 89 soldiers, missing for 56 years. "But why didn't you search for them?" she asked. Wilson's face tensed. Who said we didn't search? But what Wilson didn't tell her would haunt Lisa for the rest of her life. April 15th, 1968, Vietnam. Dawn was breaking over Firebase Alpha when Sergeant David Martinez received his final orders. He was 23, from San Antonio, Texas, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher. 6 months into his tour, with 6 months still to go. In his breast pocket, folded carefully in a waterproof pouch, was the 12th letter he'd written to his fiancée, Maria. He wrote her every 3 days religiously. It was a promise he'd made before shipping out. The orders were unusual. Instead of their normal patrol route along Highway 9, Charlie Company was being sent northwest into the mountains. Their mission brief was vague. Post-Agent Orange cleanup operation. Area assessment and civilian population monitoring. Martinez had been in country long enough to know that vague orders usually meant someone higher up the chain didn't want to put the real mission in writing. "Sarge, you ever been up in those mountains?" asked PFC Jimmy Rodriguez. At 19, Rodriguez was the youngest man in the squad. Kid from East LA who'd enlisted to avoid a judge's ultimatum between the army and jail. Martinez checked his map one more time. The route took them through terrain he'd never seen before, dense jungle, steep ravines, and areas marked with strange symbols he didn't recognize. "First time for everything, kid," Martinez replied, but his gut was already telling him something was wrong. The convoy formed up at 0800 hours. 23 vehicles, supply trucks, personnel carriers, and 3 M113 armoured personnel carriers bringing up the rear. 89 men total, ranging in age from Rodriguez's 19 to Staff Sergeant Palmer's 34. As they rolled out of Firebase Alpha, Martinez noticed something odd. Usually, when a convoy this size departed, there would be radio chatter with other units, coordination with air support, confirmation of their route with base command. This time, radio silence. Complete communications blackout once they left the base perimeter. Martinez didn't know it yet, but their radios had been deliberately sabotaged before departure. Project Greenmind couldn't risk their test subjects calling for help. As the convoy advanced deeper into the mountains, the jungle grew thicker. Ancient trees created a canopy so dense that noon felt like twilight. The air became heavy, humid, and strangely quiet. No bird calls, no insect sounds. Even the constant drone of helicopters that usually filled Vietnam's skies was absent here. Their radios began crackling with static around hour 3. "Base, this is Charlie 7. Radio reception deteriorating," Martinez reported into his handset. No response, just the empty hiss of dead air. Rodriguez, riding in the passenger seat, kept consulting his compass. "Sarge, something's not right. We should be heading northwest, but the compass says we're going due north. Almost like there's some kind of magnetic interference." Martinez took the compass, tapped it, shook it. The needle spun wildly before settling on a reading that made no sense given their route. At 14:30 they saw the first truly strange thing. Plastic containers hanging from tree branches, suspended by military-grade rope. The containers were filled with coloured liquids, some green, some amber, some a sickly yellow that seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight. "What the hell is that?" Rodriguez asked, pointing up at the hanging bottles. Martinez pulled out his binoculars and focused on the nearest container. There were labels, English text. And at the bottom, in small print, he could make out US Army Chemical Corps and a series of numbers he didn't recognize. "Keep the convoy moving," he ordered, but his voice betrayed his growing unease. The bottles weren't random. They formed a pattern, marking their route like some kind of twisted breadcrumb trail. Every quarter mile, more containers. Different colours, different labels, but all bearing US military markings. The trail markers weren't from the enemy. They'd been hung by those expecting their arrival. Staff Sergeant Palmer's voice crackled over the radio from the lead vehicle. "Martinez, you seeing this? These bottles, they're marking our route. Someone's been expecting us." But the real shock came next. When the convoy crested a hill, the scene in the valley was nothing any of them expected. A village, but a strange village. The houses didn't look destroyed. People were moving, but very slowly. Robotic movements. Martinez scanned the village with his binoculars. Children were playing. But for 10 minutes they repeated the same game, the same movements. "Chemical," Rodriguez whispered. "Not Agent Orange. Something else." But the horror they witnessed in that village was nothing compared to what waited for them at their destination. Martinez's stomach turned. He clutched the letter in his pocket. What could he write to Maria? "Darling, today we found a village. The people inside were like zombies." As the convoy passed the village, the children looked up, all at once, all with the same empty stare. They waved, slow, mechanical waves. "Floor it," Martinez ordered the driver, but they couldn't escape what they'd already seen. And what had already seen them. 2 hours later, they reached their supposed destination, a clearing in the jungle. But instead of an Agent Orange cleanup site, they found something else entirely. A research facility, hidden under camouflage nets that seemed to shimmer and shift in the fading daylight. American flags, American soldiers, American scientists in white coats. But there was something off about everyone Martinez could see. They moved with the same mechanical precision he'd witnessed in the village. Perfect posture, synchronized movements. And when they turned to look at the arriving convoy, Martinez saw those same pale, artificial blue eyes. A colonel approached their lead vehicle. Martinez couldn't make out his face from this distance, but his uniform was pristine, too pristine for someone supposedly running a cleanup operation in the middle of the Vietnamese jungle. "Welcome to Project Green Mine," the colonel said as Martinez dismounted. "You're right on time." The colonel was tall, probably in his 40s, with greying hair and those same unsettling blue eyes. His name tag read Harrison, but Martinez had never heard of a Colonel Harrison in their chain of command. "Sir, our orders were area patrol and civilian population assessment," Martinez said carefully, maintaining military protocol despite every instinct telling him to get his men out of there immediately. Harrison smiled. It was the most unnatural smile Martinez had ever seen. Too wide, held too long, like someone practicing the expression in a mirror. "Your orders have been updated, Sergeant. You and your men are now part of something much more important than patrol duty, something that will change the nature of warfare forever." Rodriguez grabbed Martinez's arm. "Sarge, look." Behind the main facility, partially hidden by camouflage netting, were other vehicles. Military vehicles that had clearly been there for much longer than a simple cleanup operation would require. Some looked like they'd been abandoned for months, others for years. Jeeps with bullet holes, personnel carriers with their doors torn off, supply trucks loaded with equipment that had long since been stripped by jungle humidity and rot, and scattered around these vehicles were personal items. Dog tags, helmets, boots, family photos, the detritus of soldiers who'd arrived here and... What? Left on foot? Been transferred? Martinez's training kicked in. Count the vehicles, estimate personnel capacity, calculate how many soldiers those abandoned vehicles could have carried. The numbers made his blood run cold. "How many convoys have you brought here?" Martinez asked, his hand unconsciously moving closer to his sidearm. Harrison's unnatural smile never wavered. "You're the 23rd, he replied, "and hopefully the last we'll need." Martinez felt the world spinning. 23 convoys. How many soldiers? How many families back home still waiting? What the colonel revealed next made Martinez realize they were never meant to leave this place alive. "What is this place?" he demanded. The colonel gestured toward the facility. "We're perfecting a serum, Sergeant. Something that will make our soldiers more compliant, more focused, less prone to the moral hesitations that lose wars." Rodriguez was backing away slowly. "That village, those people. Test subjects," the colonel said matter-of-factly. "Local villagers who volunteered for the program. Well, eventually volunteered. But Martinez had already made his decision. The letter in his pocket, Maria waiting at home, his men trusting him to bring them home alive. "We're leaving," he said firmly. The colonel's smile vanished. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Sergeant. You've seen too much, but don't worry. After the treatment, you won't remember any of this. You'll just remember serving your country with perfect loyalty." That's when Martinez made a decision that would save countless lives but cost him everything. "We're leaving," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Now." Harrison shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Sergeant. You've seen too much, but don't worry. After the treatment, you won't remember any of this. You'll just remember serving your country with perfect loyalty." Martinez saw the trap now, the isolated location, the communication blackout, the abandoned vehicles of previous convoys. They'd been led here not for a mission, but for conversion, to become part of Harrison's army of chemically lobotomized super soldiers. He thought of the letter in his pocket, the promises he'd made to Maria, the oath he'd taken to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Sometimes the greatest enemies wore the same uniform you did. "Rodriguez," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Harrison. "The radios." Rodriguez understood immediately. If they couldn't escape, if they couldn't survive, they could at least ensure this place stayed hidden. No more convoys, no more soldiers led into this chemical nightmare. "If you're going to do this," Martinez said to Harrison, "you're going to have to do it the hard way, We won't go quietly, we won't volunteer, and we sure as hell won't make it easy for you." Harrison's artificial composure finally cracked. "You're making a mistake, Sergeant. This program is sanctioned at the highest levels. You're not just refusing orders, you're interfering with national security." "Whose nation?" Martinez shot back. "Because the America I swore to defend doesn't experiment on its own soldiers." That's when Harrison raised his sidearm. That's when the shooting started. The first shots came from the facility personnel, those blank-faced, blue-eyed former soldiers who'd already undergone Harrison's treatment. They fired with mechanical precision, but without tactical awareness. They aimed to disable, not kill. They still needed live subjects for their experiments. Martinez's men, however, had been trained for combat. Real combat, where hesitation meant death and moral flexibility could save your life. They scattered, using their vehicles for cover, returning fire with the desperate accuracy of soldiers who knew they were fighting for their souls as well as their lives. Rodriguez managed to reach their radio equipment before the first wave of enemy fire destroyed their communications array. Grenade after grenade, he systematically eliminated every piece of transmission equipment in the convoy. "If we can't call for help," he shouted over the gunfire, "at least we can make sure they can't call for more victims." It was then that Martinez realized their radios had been sabotaged before they'd even left Firebase Alpha. Project Green Mind never intended them to call for help. The firefight lasted 4 hours. When the dust finally settled and the jungle returned to its unnatural silence, 34 American soldiers lay dead in the clearing. Not from enemy fire, not from Viet Cong bullets or North Vietnamese mortars. From their own military's bullets, fired by their own countrymen who'd been chemically stripped of conscience and free will. Martinez was among the survivors. Wounded, bleeding, but alive. The colonel approached him, no longer smiling. This wasn't enemy fire, it was the institution's mirror. But what Martinez had accomplished in those 4 hours would haunt military planners for decades to come. He'd done more than destroy communication equipment. He'd created the first recorded evidence of Project Green Mind's existence. "You've ruined everything," he said. "Years of research, millions of dollars." Martinez spat blood. "Good. You realize no one will ever believe you," the colonel continued. "Officially, your convoy never made it to the target zone. Enemy action. All KIA. Your families will get flags and condolences." "They'll know the truth," Martinez said. "Will they?" The colonel pulled out his sidearm. "Or will they just know that their sons died serving their country?" Martinez closed his eyes and thought of Maria, of the letter he'd never send, of the truth he'd never be able to tell. The gunshot echoed through the jungle. March 2024. Lisa Park stood in the same clearing, now overgrown with 56 years of jungle growth. The satellite coordinates had led her team exactly here, but the site looked nothing like the sterile facility described in the classified documents she'd finally obtained. Getting those documents hadn't been easy. After Colonel Wilson's initial revelation about her grandfather's connection to Charlie Company, Lisa had spent 6 months navigating bureaucratic obstacles, Freedom of Information Act requests, and legal challenges. She'd had to prove family connection to multiple missing personnel, demonstrate legitimate journalistic purpose, and agree to certain redactions. But what she'd learned was worth the effort. Project Green Mind had been real, a joint CIA-Army program designed to create chemically enhanced soldiers who would follow orders without question. The project had been classified at levels so high that most military personnel didn't even know classification numbers that Extreme existed. Hidden under decades of vegetation, they found the facility. Empty now. Abandoned. But the evidence was still there, preserved by the jungle's humid embrace like a time capsule of American military shame. Concrete buildings, their roofs collapsed but walls still standing. Laboratory equipment, corroded beyond use but still recognizable. Chemical storage tanks, long since drained, but bearing labels that made Lisa's camera crew visibly uncomfortable. Files. Thousands of pages of research documents stored in metal filing cabinets that had somehow survived the tropical climate. Photos of test subjects, both Vietnamese villagers and American soldiers, showing the progression of chemical treatment over time. Names of convoy personnel, listed not as soldiers but as research subjects. Detailed notes on psychological degradation, chemical dosage levels and behavioral modification success rates. And in a rusted footlocker hidden behind a collapsed section of wall, she found something that made her hands shake with anger more than fear. And the paper in that rusted box repainted the entire picture. Letters, hundreds of unsent letters home, from soldiers who never got to say goodbye. But one letter would change everything the world thought it knew about these missing soldiers. One letter changed everything. Lisa picked up one letter, its ink faded but still readable. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the penmanship of someone who knew these might be his last words. My darling Maria, if you're reading this, then someone finally found the truth we died protecting. We weren't heroes, we weren't cowards either. We were just soldiers who discovered that sometimes the real enemy isn't in the jungle, it's in the uniform standing right next to you. Colonel Harrison told us we would become perfect soldiers. No fear, no doubt, no conscience. We would follow any order without question, kill any target without hesitation, sacrifice anything for victory without moral injury. He was right about one thing: war would be easier without a conscience. But we are not machines. We are not tools to be programmed. We are Americans, and Americans don't surrender their souls, not even to win a war. If we die here, know that we died free. Tell my family I loved them. Tell them I kept my promise to come home as the same man who left, even if I had to die to do it. Tell them the real enemy wasn't in the jungle. It was in the uniform, in the flag, in the promise that some victories are worth any price. They were wrong. Some prices are too high, even for victory. Especially for victory, you're David. Colonel Wilson arrived at the site 3 days later, accompanied by a full military investigation team. Forensic specialists, historians, legal advisors and media liaison officers, the full apparatus of damage control that the military deployed when decades-old secrets threatened to surface. But what Wilson discovered in the facility's records would force him to confront the darkest truth of his 30-year career. Wilson looked older than his years as he walked through the overgrown facility, reading the same documents Lisa had discovered. His face grew more haggard with each revelation. Project Green Mind was shut down in 1970, he explained to Lisa as they stood in what had once been the main laboratory. Too many soldiers went missing, too many families asking questions. Congressional oversight was getting uncomfortable. They classified everything above top secret and buried it so deep that most people with access forgot it existed. Lisa held up a photograph from the files, Vietnamese villages before and after chemical treatment. The after photos showed the same blank, blue-eyed stares she'd read about in Martinez's accounts. And the test subjects? The villagers? Wilson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Official story was Agent Orange exposure causing psychological trauma. They were relocated to treatment facilities for their own safety. The facilities were, well, they weren't treatment centers. You mean they were murdered? I mean they disappeared into a classification level so high that acknowledging their existence would require congressional approval and presidential authorization. Wilson's careful, bureaucratic language couldn't hide the horror in his voice. And the families of the soldiers? Got flag ceremonies, Gold Star medals, military burials with empty coffins, the full honor guard treatment reserved for American heroes who died in combat. Lisa showed him Martinez's letter, watching Wilson's expression change as he read David's final words. This man saved lives, Lisa said. His squad prevented dozens more convoys from walking into this trap. They died to protect other soldiers from being converted into chemical zombies. Wilson nodded slowly, his hands trembling as he folded the letter. And they were branded as traitors and cowards for 56 years, missing in action, presumed to have deserted or been captured by enemy forces. So what happens now? Wilson looked around the abandoned facility, at the rusted vehicles visible through the jungle canopy, at the makeshift graves Lisa's team had found scattered throughout the compound. Now we tell the truth, he said. All of it. No matter who it embarrasses. No matter which general's legacies it destroys. No matter which politician's careers it ends. He paused, pulling out his phone to make a call. But first, we need to find out if any of the other 22 convoy sites are still out there, and we need to find out if Project Green Mind really ended in 1970, or if it just moved to a different jungle in a different war with different soldiers who trusted their government to value their humanity more than their utility. 18 months later, families across America finally learned what happened to their sons, husbands, and fathers. Not from enemy bullets in a foreign war, but from their own military's willingness to sacrifice humanity for tactical advantage. The revelation came in stages, carefully managed by a joint congressional committee that had been secretly investigating military chemical programs since the 1970s. First, the acknowledgement that Project Green Mind had existed. Then, the admission that American soldiers had been used as test subjects without consent. Finally, the terrible truth about the 23 missing convoys and the estimated 2,000 soldiers who had been fed into Harrison's chemical machinery. David Martinez was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Not for killing enemies, but for refusing to become one. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in the face of unconscionable orders and for sacrificing his life to protect future soldiers from chemical exploitation by hostile forces within his own military command structure." It was the first Medal of Honor ever awarded specifically for resisting American military authority. Maria Martinez Thompson, now 78, accepted the medal at a ceremony in Arlington National Cemetery. She'd waited 56 years for answers. She'd waited a lifetime to learn that the boy she loved had died a hero, not a casualty of circumstance. "They tried to bury the truth with our men," she said at the ceremony, her voice strong despite her age. "But truth has a way of rising from the grave, especially when good people refuse to let it stay buried." The crowd that day included families of soldiers from all 23 missing convoys, Vietnamese villagers who had survived Project Green Mind's human experimentation, and military personnel who had spent decades carrying the secret shame of their institution's darkest chapter. But Maria's speech wasn't the most powerful moment of the ceremony. That came when she read from David's final letter, the one Lisa Park had found in that rusted footlocker in the jungle. "My David wrote, 'Americans don't surrender their souls, not even to win a war.' He was wrong about one thing, though. They weren't trying to win a war. They were trying to win the peace that comes after war by creating soldiers who could do anything without moral injury. Soldiers who could commit any atrocity and sleep soundly at night." She paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. But David and his men proved that some victories aren't worth winning, that some peace isn't worth the price, that the soul of America isn't something you can sacrifice for tactical advantage, because without that soul, there's nothing left worth defending. The Vietnamese village mentioned in the classified files was located 8 months after Lisa's initial discovery. Working with Vietnamese government officials and international humanitarian organizations, investigators found 47 surviving residents of the original test site. All still showed signs of chemical exposure from 1968. Premature aging, memory disorders, children born decades after the experiments who exhibited the same pale blue eye coloration that had marked the original test subjects. Dr. Nguyen Thi Lan, now 73, had been 17 when Project Green Mind arrived in her village. She was one of the few test subjects who had retained enough cognitive function to provide testimony about the experience. "They told us the medicine would help us resist the Americans," she testified before Congress through a translator. "They said it would make us strong, but it made us empty. For months we could not think our own thoughts. We moved like machines that looked like people." The US government established a medical fund for the surviving Vietnamese test subjects and their descendants. It was the largest war reparations payment in American history, not for military action, but for human experimentation. Congressional investigation revealed that Project Green Mind hadn't ended in 1970, as Colonel Wilson had initially believed. It had moved. Different names, different locations, different chemical compounds, but the same basic goal: creating soldiers who could follow any order without psychological consequence. Programs in Panama during the 1980s, chemical trials in Somalia during the 1990s, enhanced interrogation research during the Iraq War, each iteration more sophisticated, more carefully hidden, more legally protected than the last. The investigators found evidence of at least 47 different chemical warfare programs targeting American military personnel between 1968 and 2019. Most had been shut down when oversight became too intensive or when test subjects began asking uncomfortable questions. But some were still active. Senator Patricia Chen, chair of the investigating committee and a Navy veteran herself, delivered the final report's conclusions in a speech that would define her political legacy. We must ask ourselves a fundamental question. Are we willing to preserve American values by destroying the Americans who defend them? Project Green Mind and programs like it represent a perversion of military necessity, the idea that victory justifies any sacrifice, even the sacrifice of our soldiers' humanity. She held up a photograph of David Martinez taken just weeks before his deployment to Vietnam. This young man died to preserve something more important than tactical advantage. He died to preserve the principle that American soldiers are citizens first, weapons second, that we serve our nation's values, not just our nation's interests. The committee's final recommendation was unprecedented: the establishment of a permanent congressional oversight body with the authority to investigate any military program involving human subjects, chemical agents, or psychological manipulation. Military personnel would be protected under whistleblower statutes specifically designed to protect them from retaliation for reporting unethical research. It was named the Martinez Commission, after the sergeant who had died, rather than become a government-programmed killing machine. But the most lasting impact of the Project Green Mind revelations wasn't legislative or institutional. It was personal. Lisa Park's documentary, The Lost Convoy, When Soldiers Become Test Subjects, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about the cost of military superiority and the price of unquestioning loyalty. Veterans organizations began reporting increased numbers of former service members coming forward with stories of unexplained medical procedures, memory gaps, and chemical exposure during their service. Many had stayed silent for decades, afraid they wouldn't be believed or worried about damaging military morale. The documentary gave them permission to speak. Dr. Sarah Chen, a military psychiatrist who had treated PTSD cases for 20 years, testified before Congress about the psychological impact of the revelations. For many veterans, learning about Project Green Mind confirmed suspicions they'd carried for decades. They knew something had happened to them, but they couldn't prove it. The official acknowledgement of these programs provided validation for experiences they'd been told were impossible. She paused, consulting her notes. But it also raised a terrifying question. If the military was willing to chemically alter soldiers' personalities and memories, how many veterans are carrying experiences they can't remember? How many are living with the psychological consequences of experiments they never knew they participated in? The question haunted military families across the country. Wives wondered if their husbands' post-deployment personality changes were from combat stress or chemical manipulation. Children wondered if their fathers' strange behavioral patterns were symptoms of PTSD or evidence of mind control experimentation. Support groups formed in cities across America, not just for veterans, but for families trying to understand whether their loved ones had been victimized by their own government's chemical warfare research. The Martinez Foundation, established with Maria's Medal of Honor pension and donations from families of the lost convoys, provided counseling services specifically for families affected by military human experimentation. Within 2 years, they were operating in 23 states and had a waiting list of over 3,000 families seeking services. 5 years after Lisa Park first spotted those geometric shapes in satellite imagery, she returned to Vietnam for a follow-up documentary. The jungle had reclaimed most of the facility, but Vietnamese and American investigators were still finding evidence buried in the tropical soil. Personal effects, dog tags, fragments of vehicles from convoys that had never been officially acknowledged as missing. Each discovery added another name to the growing list of soldiers who had been fed into Project Green Mind's machinery. Standing in the same clearing where David Martinez had made his final stand, Lisa reflected on the story that had consumed 5 years of her life. "Sometimes people ask me if I wish I'd never found those satellite images," she said, speaking to her camera crew for what would become the final scene of her follow-up documentary. "They ask if I think some secrets should stay buried." She picked up a rusted dog tag from the ground, one of hundreds that had been scattered across the facility grounds when the project was hastily shut down in 1970. But secrets don't protect the innocent. They protect the guilty. David Martinez and his men didn't die to keep secrets. They died to expose them. They died so other soldiers wouldn't have to sacrifice their souls for someone else's definition of victory. The tag in her hand belonged to PFC James Rodriguez, 19 years old, from East Los Angeles. Another young man who had trusted his government to value his humanity more than his utility as a weapon. "The real tragedy isn't that these experiments happened," Lisa continued. "It's that they happened to people who volunteered to serve. People who signed up to protect American values and were instead used to test how thoroughly those values could be chemically erased." She placed the dog tag in a collection bag. It would be returned to Rodriguez's family, along with an official acknowledgement that he had died serving his country, just not in the way anyone had imagined. Every generation has to decide what it's willing to sacrifice for security, what it's willing to surrender for victory. David Martinez answered that question in 1968. America's soul is not for sale, not even to win a war. The documentary ended with footage of the Martinez Commission's first hearing, where military personnel testified under oath about chemical experimentation programs that were still classified, still active, still turning soldiers into test subjects without their knowledge or consent. It was a reminder that the battle David Martinez had died fighting wasn't over. It had just moved from a jungle clearing in Vietnam to hearing rooms in Washington, from chemical laboratories to congressional committees, from secret facilities to public testimony. The war for the soul of the American military was still being fought, and the outcome was still in doubt. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Project Green Mind revelations was the simplest: a change in the oath taken by American military personnel. The traditional oath had always ended with the phrase, "So help me God." The new oath, implemented in 2027 and known informally as the Martinez Oath, added a single line: "I will preserve my conscience as carefully as I preserve my life, for without conscience, service becomes slavery, and slavery cannot defend freedom." It was a small change, just 21 words. But those words represented a fundamental shift in how America viewed its military personnel, not as weapons to be programmed, but as citizens in uniform whose humanity was as important as their effectiveness. Maria Martinez Thompson lived to see the first graduation ceremony where new recruits took the Martinez Oath. At 81, confined to a wheelchair, but with eyes still bright with the determination that had sustained her through 56 years of waiting for answers, she watched as young men and women promised to preserve their conscience along with their country. David would be proud, she whispered to Lisa, who had accompanied her to the ceremony. He always said the hardest battle isn't fighting the enemy, it's staying human while you do it. The ceremony concluded with a reading from David's final letter, the one Lisa had found in that rusted footlocker, the one that had started the avalanche of revelations that changed American military culture forever. Americans don't surrender their souls, not even to win a war. It had become the unofficial motto of military personnel who chose conscience over command, humanity over efficiency, moral courage over tactical advantage. And in a small cemetery in San Antonio, Texas, there's a headstone that finally tells the truth. David Martinez, soldier, patriot, hero, he chose conscience over command. The inscription includes a QR code that links to his final letter, ensuring that future generations can read the words of a 23-year-old sergeant who died rather than let his government chemically erase his capacity for moral choice, because some prices are too high to pay, even for victory. Especially for victory. The real question isn't whether we can trust our military to protect us from our enemies. It's whether we can trust ourselves to protect our military from becoming something that betrays everything they volunteered to defend. If a 23-vehicle convoy can vanish without a trace for 56 years, How many other secrets are still buried in classified files? How many other soldiers are still waiting for someone to tell their story? How many other families are still hoping for answers that may never come? But more importantly, how many current military personnel are being subjected to programs they don't understand, experiments they never consented to, chemical alterations they'll never remember? The Martinez Commission is still investigating, still finding evidence, still uncovering programs that turn soldiers into test subjects and patriots into experiments. Because the war David Martinez died fighting isn't history. It's happening right now, in facilities we can't see, under classifications we can't access, to soldiers who trust their government to value their humanity more than their utility. Subscribe for more stories that challenge what we think we know about the cost of freedom. Share this story so more people understand that sometimes the greatest threats to American values come from people wearing American uniforms. And remember, the most dangerous enemy isn't the one shooting at you from across the battlefield. It's the one standing right next to you, wearing the same flag, promising that victory justifies any sacrifice, even the sacrifice of your soul.